Hello and welcome to the special broadcast of the launch of the Development Support Monitor for 2011. I'm Eleni, Giokos, and over the next half an hour, my panel of expert guests and I will be discussing and dissecting this year's findings, including whether African governments and developmental partners have met commitment targets, as well as the economic challenges and opportunities that are present on the continent. Joining me now on the panel is South African Finance Minister Pravin Gordhan, Archbishop Njongo Ndungane, founder and president of the African Monitor, Dr. Ibrahim Assane Mayaki, the CEO of NEPAD Agency, and Lynette Chen, the CEO of NEPAD Business Foundation. Thank you very much to all of you for joining us. Great to have you on the program. Let's start off with you, Archbishop. Let's contextualize the scenario that is playing out right now on the African continent, and looking at the Development Support Monitor 2011. What is the premise that drove African Monitor to embark on such a concise report?
Africa is in the brink of a development breakthrough, and for us, in order not to miss out on this momentous period, we need to increase economic opportunity for grassroots communities, that's the ordinary people on the ground in Africa. And for us to do that, we have got to invest in agriculture, which provides livelihoods to a large number of people who depend on subsistence farming. We have got to recognize the informal sector as a legitimate activity which brings about economic opportunity to a large number of people in our continent, and therefore factor it in the mainstream of our economies in Africa. And thirdly, development has got to be people-focused. Development is about people, for people, and with people. And what that entails is that all the sectors in our societies, including grassroots communities, have got to be factored in policy making and decision making processes.
Minister, over to you. Let's touch on South Africa as a leader in the African continent. Given the fact that we are the powerhouse of Africa from an economic perspective, what kind of contribution should South Africa be making with regards to making sure that the unheard voices that the Archbishop was alluding to are in fact heard?
The voices of the poor and the marginalized are often not heard, and advocacy of this kind is very important to get the balance right between elites who normally dominate these sorts of channels and the voices that come from below. Secondly, before I get to the South Africa's contribution, I think the context that the Archbishop paints out is a very important one to emphasize. Particularly since the financial crisis in 2008, what we are seeing our world go through, the planet go through, is a very important and historic transition. It's a transition which is going to see economic and political power shifting from one part of the world to another part of the world. Already China is the second largest economy, although substantially lower than the United States in the globe. And it is in this context that Africa needs to position itself, and has already been positioned. 1 billion people, 54 countries, huge potential in agriculture, in natural resources, and 1 billion potential consumers at a time when the world is looking for greater what is called aggregate demand. And the world is increasingly realizing that Africa is in fact the future over the next 20 to 30 years. Of course, the future just doesn't come to you. The future has to be seized. The future has to be one which is realized through hard work, through imaginative visions, and through bold leadership, and of course practical activity on the ground. And it's in that context that South Africa, in the multilateral fora, whether it's IMF and World Bank or last week's G20 meeting, has taken on the role of being the voice for not itself only, but the African continent as well. So over the last year, for example, in the context of the G20, very important work has happened through a development committee, 11 infrastructure projects, many of them on the African continent, a lot more precise talk about how we would get investment in infrastructure on the African continent. Lots of work done on promoting agriculture, ensuring greater food security, understanding better food price volatility, which affects the poor in particular. Research work and important decisions taken on financial inclusion, which ensures that people at the grassroots level are also part of financial systems. And then lastly, support for small business. Now, all of these are, if you like, drowned by the noise that we hear from Europe at this point in time and the instability that we see there. But these were important decisions that G20 leaders made last week, which have very positive potential effects on the African continent. But of course, the question is, what is it that we in Africa need to do to capitalize on these possibilities?
And the Millennium Development Goals, Dr. Mayaki, let's touch on that. We've got intermediate milestones that perhaps Africa has missed. Globally, a few countries have also missed. But give us an indication of the fact that some say that we are about 5 years behind reaching our MDGs and the role of NEPAD going forward.
Precisely on the issue of the MDGs, I would just like to contextualize a little bit. When NEPAD is formulated in 2001, it is after a long period of structural adjustment programs. And the main consequence of the structural adjustment programs was to eliminate the capacity of African governments to think strategically. So NEPAD as a framework was a response to that vacuum. And the second main motivation behind the NEPAD framework was to re-establish the concept of planning. And planning, as we actually see, is becoming a critical dimension in policy making. When the MDGs were formulated, these mechanisms related to strategic thinking and planning did not really exist. So we rushed into processes which were not optimal in terms of organization, in terms of thinking, in terms of concrete projects. So it is one of the main reasons why we are behind in the attainment of the MDGs. But the good thing is, in the last 15 years, we have seen a strong economic performance throughout the continent. Today, 6 out of the 10 fastest growing economies are Africans. And it's not mainly driven by commodity prices. It is also the consequence of sound macroeconomic policies and the renewal of what I was calling the capacity to plan. We still have a huge challenge. Africa is the most unequal continent in the world. And that inequality has to be tackled. And if it has to be tackled, we need to give a larger space to the ordinary citizen and the grassroots communities.
Lynette, why would you say that we haven't actually given a larger space, as Dr. Mayaki was alluding to the grassroots person in Africa, given the fact that we've experienced immense growth in Africa before, only to be followed by a recession and, of course, downtime, because we are so reliant on what happens on a global level?
I think that if you look at what's happening on a global level, there are definitely shifts. We're seeing the established and developed economies crumbling, which has then provided now a lot more opportunities for developing nations like China, India, Brazil, and certainly Africa. And I also would like to congratulate the Archbishop on a very well-written report, because as development and investment happens, yes, certainly the people at the grassroots level do get forgotten about. And what we're trying to do from a business perspective is to encourage companies and corporates that are investing in Africa to try and take advantage of all these opportunities, the 1 billion people market, the mineral resources, etc., is to look at changing the way that they do business. Changing their business models and not only just looking for a pure return on investment, but looking at how can they engender and grow the local economy as well, which means that you incorporate local communities in the growth path as well, which means that for any investor, they should really consider things like local employment, local investment and joint ventures with SMEs, local procurement from SMEs, and providing the capacity and training to help them build and supply, even if it's the nuts and bolts that they need for building.
And of course, NEPAD plays a role in this scenario.
Yeah.
Archbishop, NEPAD has been in existence for around almost 10 years. I think its anniversary is imminent. I know in the report you talk a lot about policy and implementation, and the fact that perhaps policy needs to be amended so that it does suit the people on the ground in Africa. What is your prognosis with regards to the successes and failures of NEPAD?
I would imagine that one of the things that's important in developing strategies for development in our continent is for partnerships between government to create a space for things to happen, business to provide the know-how, the resources, and civil society to be involved, because for development to be effective, it must involve people on the ground. I think what has happened is that maybe there's been a disconnect in seeking to implement the policies that to a large extent are very good, but it's the implementation which requires all the sectors to play a role in making that to happen.
So it sounds like it comes down to leadership at the end of the day, Minister. Perhaps policy could be there. We see the EU-AU summit. We see quite a lot of money being committed to assisting Africa to meet up with its targets. Is leadership lacking across the continent? Is that a big issue for you?
Yes and no. I think we've been fortunate that we at least have, if you like, NEPAD as both an institution and as a vision of what is possible on the African continent. I think we're getting leadership in the area of infrastructure, which must now realize itself into practical projects that will create better connectivity within the African continent. So the ideas are there, the projects are there, potentially the money is there. One of the problems that Africa creates by virtue of its history is the number of countries that major roads or rail have to go through. And so the level of willingness to cooperate readily and create enabling environments to actually enable these projects to get implemented quickly is obviously key. Leadership is also required in the sense that political leaders, although they get re-elected every 4 or 5 years, need to also have a 10 and 20-year vision, because that's the transition that we need to fit into, and be humble enough to actually say, my role is for 5 years. If I'm re-elected, it might be for 10 years. But I've got to hand the baton on to somebody else as I move on, and to nonetheless ensure continuity in projects that could take 10 or 15 years to actually complete. So I think we're beginning to get the right leadership. We're beginning to put the right vision in place. Resources are beginning to get directed onto the African continent, and more will come if we can actually demonstrate that we're capable of implementing some of these projects. The Chinese, the Indians, the Brazilians, and others are already doing practical things on the ground in many, if not all, countries on the African continent. What we now require is the coherence on the one hand, and a better regional integration approach than we might have at this point in time, and a better recognition of what are the opportunities that are being created as a result of the transition that the world is going through at this point in time, and where do we fit ourselves into that transition.